right, welcome to another episode of the Rational Educator Podcast. And we're back with our trio, including our two experts, Deanna Heikkinen and Andy Bernstein. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi, Joel. Hey, Dr. D. How you guys doing today?
Doing well, thanks.
All right, what we want to talk about today is a story that Andy brings us from his upcoming book on education. It's a story about educational success that comes from a place that you might least expect it. We here on the Rational Educator Podcast, if you're a frequent listener, you know that we are not particularly happy with the state of American education right now, and it's hard to find any alternatives to the current system unless you completely disengage and go to the homeschooling option. But Andy has a story about the state of privately run schools in the African continent. Andy, what do you have to say about these schools?
Well, thank you, Joel. First of all, I want to credit the English educational researcher and professor James Tooley. I'm holding one of his books in my hand, Really Good Schools, and I would certainly recommend it to anybody who's interested in education, in outstanding education. And Tooley is, I'm reading from the back here, is Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham in England, where he also serves as Professor of Educational Entrepreneurship and Policy. Well, that's a big title, right? Professor of Educational Entrepreneurship and Policy. Anyhow, Tooley's written several books on this topic, and he's discovered, actually going into any number of poverty-stricken countries in Africa and in Asia, whether it was Kenya or Uganda or in India and in China. He's discovered in all of these countries, and many others in Africa and Asia, thousands and thousands of small, low-cost, sometimes profit-driven private schools where you'd least expect to find it in the most poverty-stricken slum areas of these third world countries, if I can use Mao's term, that are academically successful, where they're certainly outperforming these small, again, I want to say that small, relative handful of students in many cases, small, privately owned and low cost. They're very inexpensive, but by our standards, and sometimes for-profit private schools that academically, by every possible metric, are outperforming the government schools in those countries, and that are preferred by many, many, many parents. It's an amazing success story in places where you least expect to find education, private education shining. So that's an introduction, I think, to what Tooley has discovered.
How does Tooley describe how these schools are able to succeed, particularly when juxtaposed against the government systems? What's the difference between these private schools and government schools? Well,
for one thing, they're very inexpensive, so that the poor parents in these areas can afford to send their kids there. And, they're often like a labor of love by the entrepreneurs involved who recognize, again, a number of cases, where Tooley educates, Tooley interviews various people who run the schools, teach in the schools, or who send their children to the schools. What they recognize, the government schools are simply not providing the academic performance that parents want. And it's striking to me when you read this. One thing that's striking to me as I was reading Tooley's book, Really Good Schools, is that so many parents all over the world, even in the most poverty-stricken, often war-torn areas, want their kids to learn academic subjects. They want their children to be able to read well, to write well, to master arithmetic and mathematics. They want their kids to get an academic education over and over and over again. It's striking how the parents in these areas, they have very, very different ideas on what education should do than does the interlocking directorate in the United States. The teachers' colleges, the state and federal departments of education. The parents want the kids to get an academic education. They want their kids to learn to read. The classic 3 R's: read, write, and arithmetic, and more. More academics. It's striking. And so these these schools focus on the academics that the parents want more than the government schools focus on. And so parents are willing to spend some of their hard-earned money to send their kids to these private schools.
Is Tooley suggesting that the reason that the government schools are so bad is that they're not focused on academic subjects?
Well, I think that's part of it. And also in these countries, there's this vast bureaucracy, and the teachers have gone to college. So they're very, it's very rare that people, in these starving countries have college degrees. And they're the elite, and they regard themselves as the elite. And Tooley says over and over again, they'll show up, for a little while in the morning. Maybe they'll teach a little bit. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just have the kids do busy work, or do prayers, or they'll send them to the auditorium for something, for some kind of show or performance or whatever. And then they leave by noon. He said there's nothing you can do about it. Here's a story of one father who went in to the school to complain. I forget, it was one of the African countries, went into the school to complain, and the teachers called the police, had him arrested. They put him up on trial. How dare you, a fisherman, challenge us? We've been educated in the state universities. We're the experts. We're the elite. And they sent this guy to prison. And had to pay a fine and everything that he couldn't afford. There's a vast bureaucracy that has power. It's very elitist. They don't answer to the parents. They don't regard parents as customers, because the parents are not customers. They have no regard for the parents' preferences. Does this sound familiar? I mean, it sounds like, Terry McAuliffe or, somebody in the United States.
It absolutely does. It's interesting about these private schools, because when I was in my doctoral program for education, we looked at a lot of international schools in a couple of the classes, and what they focused on in the program and what they're teaching at the teachers' colleges is looking at the PISA scores, which are the international tests that are given to 15-year-olds to test their abilities in math and reading and writing. And the top ranking schools are typically like 3 of them that they really talked about. Again, this was a few years ago, but Finland, Hong Kong, Singapore are always at the top. And so they would actually even have these kind of field trips, if you will, or these study abroad programs. You could, it would be a couple of weeks. It wasn't necessarily for credit, but it was just kind of it would augment the education. And you would either go to Finland or Hong Kong or Japan or Singapore, and you would go around and tour these schools. And so they're still looking at these traditional models of reading, writing, arithmetic. But what's ironic about it is that that's no longer the focus of what they're telling teachers to teach. It's all about, at least in America, what's coming out of the teachers' colleges is, about diversity of anything. And they're pushing that, yet they're still admiring these different places. And then they'll go over there, and American educational philosophers will go over there, they'll study, they'll look, and they're like, why doesn't the Finland model apply to America? And I mean, it's okay, our population size, our demographics are very different than Finland's demographics. And so things like that are very different, but they're trying to find this one size fits all model. And it looks like, from what you're saying, Dr. Andy, Africa is just completely going away from that, and they're having success. They're doing their own thing, and they're innovators. And that's what we need in education, is innovation.
No, you're absolutely right, Dr. D. And I think it would be interesting comparison of some research compared the academic results from this growing number of micro schools in the United States, or these small community schools where you have a disgruntled teacher opt out of the government school system because often women, but once in a while men, I suppose, she finds that she wants to teach the kids academic subjects, but she's pitted against a stifling bureaucracy. So she finds a few disgruntled families and they start a small community school or micro school in one of the family's basements, for like 4 families or something. It's relatively inexpensive to send your kids there. That's similar to these small, low cost, privately owned, and sometimes profit-driven schools by the thousands that Tooley investigates in Asia and Africa. And he shows, on the achievement tests that are given in various countries, the private versus public is always the largest determining factor on how the kids do in their native language, in mathematics, in English, and English as a second language. The main determinant of outcome is not rich kids versus poor kids. It's not literate mothers versus illiterate mothers, or literate fathers versus illiterate fathers. It's the private versus government schools that's by far the major difference Tooley showed over and over again, because the private schools are more responsive to parental demand for academic education. I think it's similar to the small micro school or small community school models that are just starting to flourish in the United States.
Andy, I know that the 3 of us here on this call are big fans of capitalism, and we know that privately run entities will generally function better than their government counterparts. But in America, private schools, what we think of as private schools, is simply the same kind of large classroom, brick and mortar entities that we see with public schools, only that they don't receive government funding. So in previous episodes, we've talked about how private schools, what we think of generally as private schools, not the micro schools, but these private schools, are not a great alternative to public schools. And I think, Deanna has done some research on this topic and knows a little bit about why private schools are not a great alternative.
One of the things is that they still have accrediting bodies, and those accrediting bodies are the same ones, or they have the same things that are being pushed on the public schools. There are also, their teachers a lot of times are, they're going to have to be college graduates, but a lot of times they'll look for teachers that have some sort of education background. Private schools used to, like, if you were going to teach history, they would have a lawyer who maybe had a history degree, and they're kind of moving away from that. And so another misnomer is that some private schools in some states do get some state funding. And so that is up to the states. Remember, education is not in the Constitution in the United States. And so it is a local thing. So each state is different. And some states decide whether local taxes can fund private schools. So then you're also going to have some infiltration there as well. So just because they're private doesn't mean that they're completely outside of that government funding. Again, it's different states treat things differently. They may not be able to fund religious schools, but there are a lot of private schools that are secular, and there are more and more of those popping up that could get funding.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Deanna, because you went through the educational program, but I believe that overwhelmingly educational philosophers and educational professors in the United States tend to be leftist, politically correct, and in today's terminology, woke. And so,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I had a hard time even when I was there. I wanted to write a dissertation. And I really wanted to focus on history of educational policy in the United States, going back to the Constitution, and then really starting in 1965 with Johnson and the ESEA, and then going forward. That's what I wanted to do for my dissertation, and they wouldn't allow that. And so then I decided, well, they wanted you to do a study where you interviewed people. They wanted you to do a particular model of research, and that's what you pretty much got pigeonholed into doing. And so I decided to look at intellectual diversity because personally,
what a concept.
I know. I thought that, well, isn't education about thinking and thoughts and your mind? So I wanted to look at intellectual diversity as opposed to these other diversities that I don't really think have that much of an impact on the mind or learning. I don't think whatever color your skin, we all have a capacity for learning as long as we have a healthy brain. And so it was shocking to me. I couldn't find anybody to chair my dissertation or find people to serve on my committee because I wanted to look at intellectual diversity in higher education. And what I found going through the program and then also interviewing professors around the country about this particular topic is that, yes, most of the colleges, the professors, particularly teaching colleges, but even professors across the board on college campuses in the United States skew left. And I think, and this was in 2017, 2016, when I was doing my research. And so it was, and it's gotten a lot worse in the last few years.
Right. So I think that, Joel, I think the educational philosophy that dominates many of the private schools, not all of them, but many of them, is similar to what dominates the government schools. And that is, we're not so interested in teaching the kids academics, but we want to teach them about racism, and we want to sexualize the kids. We want to teach them about homosexuality, various gay issues, and we want to teach critical race theory. We want to teach them that America is a racist, systemically racist country, and how we're going to bring about equity in the country. They're quote reformers for basically leftist political agenda more than they are academic educators. So I think that's why the main reason why many of the private schools in the United States are as bad as not all, but many of them as bad as the government schools.
It goes back to that accreditation where a lot of them are now, to meet their accreditation, which they need to be accredited in order for families to send their kids there. They want that stamp of approval. They now have to have diversity officers on those private school campuses in a lot of places because of the accrediting boards. And these accrediting boards, even for private schools, are populated by people coming out of the teachers' colleges. So there's no winning, really.
But what you're also doing is getting what these very expensive private schools are getting the best, what is considered to be the best teachers that money can buy. But the standard of what is greatness is what is in fashion. And what is in fashion today is wokeness. If you go up and down the most prestigious, most exclusive prep schools up and down the East Coast, you'll see that their board of directors and all of their staff are populated by woke ideology, because that's what's in fashion and that's what their money can get you now.
And that's relatively new, I think, because probably even as recently as 20 years ago or less, those top prep schools on the East Coast that you're talking about, Phillips Exeter, Andover, Choate, these Ivy League kind of, prep schools, they prided themselves on having teachers who had degrees in the subject matter they would teach rather than in education. And that they, therefore, anyone who was teaching history had degrees in history. And anyone who was teaching mathematics had degrees in mathematics, and same for literature and so on. And that they focused on academic training, and and they were much better than the government schools. But I do believe that commitment to academics has been severely undermined by a woke political agenda.
And all you have to do is redefine these academic subjects as evil, as racist, as sexist, as anythingist. Because once you do that, then the field is open for whatever propaganda you want to inject, which is actually the real purpose of redefining these academic subjects according to this kind of moral standard. If you read the educational literature over the past 100 years.
We're talking about these private small private schools in Africa. And we do have, like Dr. Andy mentioned, we do have a little bit of that happening. And I think it really caught on because of what happened with COVID and the pandemic. And so, and I'm not sure that we're seeing a lot of these pop up. I haven't heard a lot about it recently. So I don't know if that's still kind of prevalent, that you still have families that are really wanting to, continue to take their kids out of school. I do know that homeschooling, families that decided to homeschool, a lot of them didn't go back. And so what states are doing, or districts or areas are doing, is sort of calculating that student funding, because students didn't come back like they thought they would. So maybe these little micro schools, maybe that's the way to fix the American education system, is that you have high school or homeschooling, and then you have these micro schools. And instead of trying to bring Finland or Hong Kong or Singapore, because they have these high test scores here, maybe looking to these schools in Africa, that's the way to go. I think it's a great start, and it's innovative, and that's what we need.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It depends on, like you pointed out, Dr. D, the teachers have to go through the teacher training. And so most of them are indoctrinated with the vicious philosophy and anti-academic racist philosophy that's au courant, that's so prevalent today. But if there are still good teachers, teachers who recognize, and I think there are, in the government schools, that the kids need to learn to read, they need phonics, they need academics, they need to learn real American history and so on, then those are the teachers who are candidates they get so disgusted with the system and the anti-academics that they opt out. And some of them might go into other fields, but some of them may want to continue to teach. And they're the ones who will start the small community schools, or the micro schools as they're known today. And there was an article in Forbes, in a business magazine, about this. I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, about the prevalence, of how often this is happening in our day. And all you need is one teacher and a handful of parents who are disgusted with the schools, and you could start a micro school. And we've discussed on this show how, and Dr. D, you pointed out a number of times, some states make it more difficult than others for parents to start a school where they're going to teach other parents' kids. But it's easier for somebody who's a certified teacher. And you get the certified teachers to opt out and start micro schools. Yeah, I think this is a very exciting development in American education. It replicates, the little country schoolhouse where you have, just a few families, a few kids. Maybe they'll even bring back McGuffey's readers. Who knows?
But, I have this fantasy of getting some land and opening up a little schoolhouse. I still have that, but in the meantime, I tutor. But it is educators like myself who are opting out of the system. I mean, I got my doctorate, and a year later I left. I just couldn't stomach it anymore. And we're seeing more and more people being pushed out by the complete insanity of what's happening in both public and private schools. So I think this is a great thing to do. I'm tutoring school students right now, but maybe someday I'll open up a micro school where I am. And I mean, it is a dream to have that one room schoolhouse. I think it's an amazing model to do, and just work with some families.
And you're a certified teacher, right? So it wouldn't be as difficult.
I have a doctorate in education. I don't have a certificate, a teaching certificate. So this is what's really funny about the laws. I have a doctorate in education, 2 master's degrees. I'm going to give you all my alphabet soup here, a double bachelor's degree. And I would have to go back to get my credential to teach if I wanted to teach junior high or high school. I'm not qualified according to them, but I have the highest level of degree in education, and I still would have to go back and get a credential. That's how insane things are now. Right. Yeah, and I have a degree in history, a master's in history, a master's in anthropology. I have an art history background, and but
you're not qualified to teach.
I'm not qualified to teach
without the
in high school without that certificate, which is just insane, because the classes that I would have to take, I've probably already had.
The amazing thing about this, though, and I think the real lesson from the success of the African schools is, particularly if you compare them against their government counterparts, is that their success comes from being left alone and not having government requirements placed on them, not having a Department of Education. And so in that vacuum, these schools can flourish because they're not being held back. When you look at the way that private schooling works in the US, I think we'd be hard pressed to call that a real alternative. The only alternative in America is to drop out of the system and let these smaller entities, these completely decentralized groups form without any kind of credentialing and without government oversight. So
yeah,
that's the real lesson here.
no, yeah, I think you're 100% correct, Joel. Here's a couple of points here. James Tooley, traveling around any number of countries in Asia and in Africa, found over and over again that government officials in these countries denied the existence of these private schools, and international aid workers also. You know, I remember one case where he was in China, and you know, somebody in the Chinese government said, "Well, you may find these kind of small, inexpensive private schools in Pakistan, you know, and various African countries, but there aren't any in China, I assure you." So he ventured out into the hinterlands, and of course, he found any number of them. So you're right, the government not only doesn't interfere if these government officials are being honest about it, they don't even know, you know, about the existence of these schools, and they don't care. So you're right. This is benign neglect. This is literally laissez-faire. They have their hands off these schools, and the entrepreneurs can start them up, and of course, get customers by satisfying customer demand, by giving the kids what the parents want for the kids, you know, academic training. And I think, so the advantages, we in the United States, we have certain advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, you know, in these starving third world countries, transportation is limited. The kids have to, you know, be in proximity to the school. In the United States, you know, we have cars and roads and, you know, and trains and everything. We could travel. Parents have houses, and you know, a lot of parents have houses with basements or backyards, rec rooms where you could set up a school, you know, for the kids. We have a lot of economic advantages, but as you pointed out, we have one gigantic disadvantage. The government micromanages here. We have to deal with the government. We don't have benign neglect here. We don't have laissez-faire. But like I said, you know, we can keep repeating this because I think it is the hope for the future. The best teachers opting out and starting micro schools. There's fewer obstacles for somebody who's a certified teacher, and you know, the government can't. The government places fewer roadblocks in the path of setting up a micro school. You know, when a teacher does it rather than when parents do it to try to educate other people's kids. One of my friends, I think I mentioned him on the show before, Mike Gustafson, was a certified teacher, young guy in his 20s, certified teacher, you know, teaching elementary schools in Massachusetts. He opted out, he and his wife set up Atlas Academy in one of the towns in Massachusetts, and they're flourishing. They have, you know, I don't know, 50 or 60 students now. I think that's the way to go. If there are still teachers in the system who really want to teach the kids academics, who understand this is what the kids need, this is the way to go. And I think the government can't stop it, at least not now.
Well, that's one ominous note of warning that we should add as a punctuation mark at the end of this sentence, because the reason that Africa doesn't have an overbearing government shutting down these micro schools is, you know, I mean, without having to travel to Africa and really take the temperature of the government officials, it's hard to say, but I suspect that any government official in charge of education in an impoverished country would see a micro school as a reproach to their policy. And if they did have the wherewithal and resources to shut them down, or at least license them into non-existence, they surely would. because that they're being made an example of. So in America, we have an overbearing government because we're the richest country on earth and can afford it. So that overbearing government can put all kinds of regulations and limitations and credentialing to make it very difficult for private schools to exist, which is why they have to kind of go underground with the existence of a micro school.
I have a
Go ahead.
caveat for that. That is by state. So I lived in Washington State and I lived in California, and those places have very, I'm just going to say it, pretty controlling Department of Eds when it comes to private schools and private education. I'm in Florida now, and Florida private schools are not regulated. They're not licensed. They're not approved. The Department of Ed has nothing to do with them. So if you want to leave and open up a little school, like leave your teaching job and open up a school, Florida is actually a really good place to do it. And I know there are probably other states as well. I haven't looked into all of them, but
thank God for federalism, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and thank God for rednecks also, because I suspect the redneck places are less, the conservative places, which have certain, flaws or problems from my standpoint,
Right.
but they're less controlling of education done by homeschoolers and by private schools.
So where I wouldn't, if I wanted to go into a public high school or middle school and teach, I would have to get my certification. But if I decided to just go to a public school or even just open up my own, I don't need any certification here. So there are some advantages. And if you happen to be listening to us and you are an educator and you are ready to leave the system, definitely just go to your whatever state you're in, look at their Department of Ed and see what their regulations and their policies are for private schools or homeschooling, because there are a lot of options.
Well, on that note, on that very positive note, then thank you for interjecting that note of positivity, Deanna. And thanks to Andy for telling us this great undiscovered story, at least undiscovered from our end. And thanks to everybody for showing up on the show today.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Deanna, and thanks to James Tooley for doing all this research and telling this story that is very important, very positive, and very inspirational regarding what the future of education could be, not just in these starving poor countries in the third world, but I keep using Mao's term, but also in the wealthy countries of the world, like the United States.
Absolutely. And Andy, I cannot wait to read your book when it comes out in the summer, Why Johnny Still Can't Read. And you have a whole chapter devoted to this. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that from you as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. D. I appreciate it.
So Andy, when's your publication date?
Late June or July. I think the book should be out. It's available for pre-order on Amazon right now, but I'm hearing from the publisher. Let's call it June. The book will be available. And I wanted to say something. My all-time favorite novel, Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. One of the characters named Stephen Mallory talks about ripping the lid off of hell, and then showing what's inside. Well, I think my book does that. It rips the lid off of hell of what's going on, in the schools and in the forces behind the schools that make it possible. And then, like we've been discussing, what are the positive alternatives? What are the positive steps parents can take to greatly improve the education of their children? So there's the negative about what the schools are like and the powers behind the schools that make them so bad, and then the positive about what parents can do to improve it. So we're ripping the lid off of hell, but then we're showing what heaven in education would look like.
Perfect.
All right, then everybody check the description or the show notes below for a link to pre-ordering, or if you're listening to us in the future, you can purchase it. So thanks again, everybody, to being on the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Deanna.